The gray Tuesday morning settled over Kane Industrial Solutions like a shroud, the kind of overcast sky that seemed to press down on everything beneath it with the weight of unspoken promises about rain that might never come. Daniel Vega stood at the edge of the manufacturing floor, watching his crew prepare for another day of turning raw steel into the precision components that had built the company's reputation over 3 decades. The familiar sounds of machinery warming up, safety checks being called out, and the easy banter between workers who had known each other for years should have been comforting. But today they felt distant, muffled by the exhaustion that clung to Daniel like smoke. 3 nights in the hospital with Elena had taken their toll. She was stable now, the doctors said, recovering from the severe pneumonia that had nearly claimed her life. But the fear still lived in Daniel's chest like a cold stone. He had held her hand through the worst of it, watching monitors and listening to the mechanical rhythm of machines that kept her breathing when her body couldn't manage alone. The company's policy manual said 3 days of unexcused absence warranted termination. But Elena was his wife, the mother of his children, and some things mattered more than policy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel, the voice cut through his thoughts with the precision of a blade. Victoria Kane stood in the doorway of the factory floor, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the industrial setting around her. She was a woman who commanded attention without effort, her platinum hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her expression carrying the kind of controlled authority that came from years of corporate warfare. My office. Now. The walk through the administrative wing felt like a march to execution. Daniel's boot wicks echoed against polished floors that reflected the fluorescent lighting overhead, each step taking him further from the world he understood into territory where words carried more weight than honest labor. Victoria's corner office occupied prime real estate on the top floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that sprawled beyond the factory walls. The space was designed to intimidate, from the imposing mahogany desk to the leather-bound volumes that lined the shelves, books that looked more decorative than functional. Victoria settled behind her desk with the fluid motion of someone who had perfected the art of projecting power through posture alone. She didn't invite Daniel to sit. The termination notice lay on the desk between them, printed on company letterhead with his name typed in neat, impersonal letters. 3 decades of employment reduced to a single page of corporate boilerplate. "We've been with you a long time, Daniel," Victoria began, her voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that felt rehearsed. "Which makes this conversation particularly difficult. Your recent attendance issues have forced us to make some hard decisions." Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came when he was being told something he knew was wrong, but lacked the authority to challenge. "My wife was dying," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any argument about policy or procedure. "I understand that family emergencies can be challenging," Victoria replied, her tone suggesting anything but understanding. "However, we have responsibilities to our shareholders, our customers, and yes, our employees who do show up consistently. Your absence disrupted production schedules and forced other workers to cover your responsibilities." The dismissal was delivered with surgical precision, each word chosen to deflect rather than engage with the human reality of what Daniel had faced. She spoke of loyalty as if it were a commodity that flowed in only one direction, from employee to company, never acknowledging that loyalty earned should be loyalty returned. When Daniel tried to explain the severity of Elena's condition, Victoria cut him off with a raised hand and a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "The decision has been made," she said, sliding the termination paperwork across the polished surface of her desk. "You'll have 30 minutes to collect your personal items. Security will escort you to ensure a smooth transition." The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have as he loaded it with the accumulated remnants of 3 decades of work. a coffee mug Elena had given him for Father's Day, worn smooth from years of use. A photograph of Louis and Sophia from their school pictures, their gap-toothed smiles frozen in a moment of childhood innocence. A small tool set that had belonged to his father Miguel, the engravings on the handles worn nearly smooth, but still readable if you knew where to look. Avery Chen appeared at his elbow as he cleared the last items from his desk, the younger man's usual jovial expression tight with anger. They had worked together for 15 years, their friendship built on mutual respect and shared frustrations with management decisions that prioritized profit margins over practical sense. "This is wrong, Daniel," Avery said, his voice low enough to avoid attracting the attention of the security guard who lurked nearby. "Elena almost died, and they fire you for being with her? What kind of people are we working for?" Daniel hefted the box, feeling the weight of everything he was leaving behind. "The kind of who see workers as replaceable parts," he replied, though the bitterness in his voice surprised him. He had always tried to see the best in people, to give them the benefit of the doubt, but Victoria Kane had made it clear that compassion was not a luxury the company could afford. As he walked toward the exit, Avery fell into step beside him. "She's been pushing out the old-timers," his friend said quietly, replacing experienced workers with cheaper labor, cutting corners on safety inspections, squeezing every penny out of operations. "This isn't about your attendance, Daniel. This is about making room for her vision of what this company should be." The automatic doors of Kane Industrial Solutions closed behind Daniel with a soft hiss that sounded like a sigh. The cardboard box, tucked under his arm, contained the visible remnants of his career, but the real weight he carried was invisible. The responsibility to provide for his family, the uncertainty of starting over at 52, and the nagging sense that something fundamental had shifted in a world where loyalty flowed in only one direction. He didn't know yet that his next stop would change everything, that a sealed envelope waiting in his father's desk drawer contained the power to transform him from discarded employee to the most important person in the building he was walking away from. Home felt different in the middle of a Tuesday morning, as if the house itself knew that Daniel's presence at this hour meant something had gone wrong with the natural order of things. Elena slept in their bedroom, her breathing steady now, but still carrying the fragile quality that reminded him how close he had come to losing her. The doctors said she would recover fully, but recovery took time, and time was a luxury that unemployment had suddenly made precious. Daniel set the cardboard box on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment, this physical representation of a career that had ended not with celebration or retirement planning, but with a security escort and 30 minutes to gather the scraps of 3 decades. The coffee mug caught the morning light streaming through the window, Elena's careful handwriting still visible on the side, "World's Best Dad," written in the purple marker that Sophia had insisted was the most beautiful color in existence. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made him look up. Luis appeared first, his 10-year-old face still soft with sleep, followed by Sophia, who clutched her favorite stuffed elephant with the determination of someone preparing for battle. They both stopped when they saw the box, their young minds processing the implications with the quick intelligence that children possessed when it came to reading the emotional weather of their household. "Papa?" Sophia's voice was small, uncertain. "Why are you home? Are you sick too?" Daniel knelt down to their level, his hands finding their shoulders with the gentle firmness that had guided them through scraped knees and bad dreams. "I'm fine, mija. There were some changes at work, and I won't be going back there anymore." Luis, older and more attuned to the complexities of adult problems, frowned. "Did they fire you because you stayed with Mama in the hospital?" The directness of the question hit Daniel harder than Victoria Kane's corporate doublespeak had. Children saw through euphemisms and polite fictions with devastating clarity, cutting straight to the heart of matters that adults preferred to dress up in prettier language. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't seem fair, Daniel said carefully, not wanting to burden his children with anger they were too young to carry, but unwilling to lie to them about the reality they faced. But we'll figure this out together, okay? Your mama and I always do. After he had sent the children off to school with extra hugs and reassurances that everything would be all right, Daniel found himself standing in the doorway of his father's study. The room had remained largely unchanged since Miguel Vega's death 5 years earlier, a space frozen in time that still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco his father had favored and the leather-bound books that lined the walls. Elena had suggested several times that they might want to convert the space into something more practical, perhaps a home office or a playroom for the children, but Daniel had never quite been ready to disturb the careful arrangement of his father's things. Miguel had been a man of secrets, Daniel reflected as he settled into the worn leather chair behind the oak desk. Not the kind of secrets that hurt families or destroyed trust, but the quiet mysteries that came from a lifetime of building something from nothing and protecting it with careful planning. He had rarely spoken about the early days of Kane Industrial Solutions, the years when he had worked 18-hour days and mortgaged everything he owned to keep the fledgling company afloat. The envelope waited in the bottom drawer of the desk, exactly where Miguel had told him it would be during one of their last conversations. "When the time comes, you'll know," his father had said, his voice already weakened by the cancer that would claim him, but his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had built an empire from ambition and determination. The heavy stock paper felt substantial beneath Daniel's fingers as he broke the wax seal that had protected its contents for half a decade. Inside, his father's careful handwriting covered several pages, the ink still dark against cream-colored paper that spoke of permanence and deliberate preservation. "My son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then circumstances have forced you to discover truths that I hoped you might never need to know. The company I built, the legacy I thought I was creating for you and your children, has been corrupted by people who see profit as more important than principle." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. The letter detailed a trust arrangement that he had never known existed. Legal documents that transferred 51% ownership of Kane Industrial Solutions to him upon his father's death, but with conditions designed to protect both him and the company from those who would exploit the situation. The shares had been held in trust, managed by Harold Bishop, a senior board member who had been Miguel's closest friend and most trusted advisor. The legal language was complex, but the intent was clear. The ownership would transfer to Daniel with full authority when certain conditions were met, including, but not limited to, acts of corporate dishonor, such as the unjust termination of Daniel himself. Miguel had foreseen the possibility that those who gained control of the company might eventually turn against the values that had built it, and he had prepared a fail-safe that would allow his son to reclaim what was rightfully theirs.
"I never told you this because I wanted you to earn your place through merit, not inheritance," Miguel's letter continued. "You worked harder than anyone else on that factory floor because you believed in honest labor and fair treatment. Those beliefs are what make you worthy of leadership, not the accident of birth that made you my son." Daniel set the letter down and stared at the accompanying legal documents, sheets of paper that transformed him from unemployed factory worker to majority shareholder of the company that had just discarded him like a broken tool. The irony was not lost on him. Victoria Kane had fired him for prioritizing family over corporate policy, never knowing that family legacy had already given him the power to reshape the very policies she enforced. The contact information for Harold Bishop was written in his father's careful script at the bottom of the final page, along with a note that felt like Miguel speaking from beyond the grave. Remember, Daniel, that power without purpose is just noise. Use this wisely and never forget where you came from. Outside, the gray morning had given way to patches of sunlight that filtered through the study windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities waiting to be born. Daniel reached for the phone, his fingers steady now as he dialed the number his father had provided. Harold Bishop answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the weight of years and the warmth of someone who had been expecting this call for a very long time. "Daniel," Harold said simply, "I've been waiting for you to call." The diner that Harold Bishop had chosen for their meeting looked like it had been transplanted from a different era, the kind of place where chrome fixtures caught fluorescent light and vinyl booths held the stories of 1,000 conversations over coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. It sat at the edge of town, where the industrial district gave way to farmland, far enough from Kane Industrial Solutions and the gossip network that sustained most small cities, that two men could speak freely without fear of being overheard by the wrong people. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early, a habit ingrained by decades of factory shifts that demanded punctuality, and found Harold already seated in a corner booth with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot. The older man looked exactly as Daniel remembered him from company meetings and rare social gatherings. Tall and lean, with silver hair that had retreated from his forehead but remained thick where it chose to grow, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent solving problems that other people preferred to avoid. "Harold," Daniel said as he slid into the booth across from him, noting how the other man's eyes quickly scanned the diner's other occupants before settling on Daniel's face with the intensity of someone who had learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between success and disaster. "Harold." Harold's handshake was firm, his grip carrying the strength that came from years of honest work before corporate responsibilities had moved him away from the factory floor. "I'm sorry it took these circumstances to bring us together. Your father always hoped you might never need to open that envelope." The waitress approached with coffee that she poured without being asked, the kind of service that came from recognizing regular customers and understanding their habits. Harold waited until she had moved away before continuing, his voice low but clear, in the way of someone accustomed to being listened to when he spoke. "Miguel saw this coming," Harold said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if drawing warmth from the ceramic. "Not the specifics, maybe, but the general direction. When the company started growing beyond what he could personally oversee, when outside investors began pushing for changes that prioritized quarterly returns over long-term stability, he knew that eventually someone would try to transform Kane Industrial Solutions into something he never intended it to be." Daniel studied Harold's face, looking for signs of the corporate doublespeak that had become so familiar in his interactions with upper management, but found instead the straightforward honesty of someone who had worked alongside his father when the company was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's name and family situation. "Why didn't he tell me?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Miguel had been a man who believed that respect had to be earned, that position without merit was just another form of corruption. "Because he wanted you to understand the company from the ground up," Harold replied, confirming Daniel's suspicions. "He used to say that you couldn't lead people through work you'd never done yourself, couldn't make decisions about their lives if you'd never lived their struggles. Every promotion you earned, every improvement you suggested, every time you stood up for a worker who was being treated unfairly, all of that was preparing you for this moment." Harold reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder that contained copies of the trust documents, legal paperwork that had been prepared with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that left no room for challenge or misinterpretation. The ownership transfer was airtight, crafted by lawyers who specialized in protecting family interests from corporate raiders and hostile takeovers. 51%, Harold said simply. enough to control the board, hire and fire executives, and reshape company policy. Your father structured it so that the shares would transfer automatically upon his death but remain in trust until specific conditions were met. Victoria's decision to fire you without cause was one of those conditions. Daniel flipped through the documents, his father's foresight becoming clearer with each page. Miguel had anticipated scenarios that ranged from financial crisis to management corruption, and had created legal mechanisms that would allow Daniel to step in when the company's
values were threatened. The trust had been generating dividends for years, money that had been quietly reinvested in the company or held in reserve for exactly this kind of situation. "She doesn't know," Daniel said, and it was not a question. "Victoria has no idea that the majority shareholder she's been answering to in board meetings is actually you," Harold confirmed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She thinks the trust is controlled by some faceless consortium of Miguel's old business partners. She spent years building her power base, never realizing that real authority was sitting in the factory break room eating lunch from a thermos." The implications were staggering. Every policy Victoria had implemented, every cost-cutting measure that had compromised safety or worker welfare, every decision that had prioritized shareholder returns over employee dignity, all of it had been done under the ultimate authority of the man she had just fired for caring more about his wife than company attendance policy. "What happens when I reveal this?" Daniel asked, though he was already beginning to understand that there was no path forward that didn't involve conflict. Victoria Kane was not the kind of person who would gracefully accept a challenge to her authority, especially not from someone she had just discarded as expendable. "War," Harold said bluntly, his expression serious. "Victoria has spent years consolidating power, placing her allies in key positions, and building relationships with investors who share her vision of maximum efficiency and minimum sentiment. When you walk into that boardroom and claim your seat at the head of the table, she'll fight you with everything she has." Daniel thought about Avery's warning regarding the systematic removal of experienced workers, the safety inspections that had been quietly discontinued, and the gradual erosion of the employee benefits that had once made Kane Industrial Solutions a place where people built careers rather than just collecting paychecks. Victoria's vision for efficiency was creating a company that his father would not have recognized, a place where workers were viewed as replaceable components rather than valuable partners in a shared enterprise. "Good," Daniel said quietly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Maybe it's time for a war. Those people on the factory floor, the ones who actually build the products that make this company profitable, they deserve better than being treated like disposable assets." Harold leaned back in his seat, studying Daniel with the appraising look of someone trying to gauge whether the person across from him had the steel necessary for the battles ahead. What he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly and extended his hand across the table. "Your father would be proud," Harold said as they shook hands. "When do you want to make your entrance?" Daniel thought about Elena recovering at home, about Louis and Sophia who deserved a future where hard work was rewarded rather than punished, about Avery and the other workers who had dedicated their lives to building something they believed in. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for next Tuesday, a gathering where Victoria would present her latest efficiency initiatives and cost reduction strategies to a room full of people who had never worked a day on the factory floor. "Tuesday," Daniel said. "Let's see how she handles a surprise she didn't see coming." As they left the diner, Harold placed a fatherly hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Remember," he said, "once you walk through those doors as the majority shareholder, there's no going back. Victoria will never forgive you for the challenge to her authority, and some of the other board members have their own reasons for preferring the current arrangement. You'll be fighting not just for control of the company, but for the soul of everything your father built." Daniel looked back toward town, where the smokestacks of Kane Industrial Solutions rose against the afternoon sky like monuments to the dreams of working people who believed that honest labor could build something lasting. In less than a week, he would walk into that building not as a discarded employee, but as the rightful owner of everything Victoria Kane thought she controlled. "Let them come," he said simply. And Harold smiled at the quiet confidence in his voice, recognizing the echo of Miguel Vega's determination in his son's words. The Kane Industrial Solutions boardroom occupied the entire north wing of the executive floor. Its mahogany table stretched like a battlefield between floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the factory complex below. Victoria Kane stood at the head of the table, her presentation slides casting precise graphs and profit projections onto the wall behind her with the kind of mathematical certainty that reduced human labor to data points and efficiency metrics. The quarterly board meeting had become her stage, a place where she performed the careful choreography of corporate leadership for an audience of investors and executives who measured success in percentages rather than people. Third quarter revenues exceeded projections by 12%, Victoria announced, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone delivering news that would translate directly into bonus payments and shareholder dividends. Cost reduction initiatives implemented over the past 18 months have streamlined operations significantly, allowing us to maintain competitive pricing while expanding profit margins. The board members nodded approvingly from their leather chairs, a collection of suits and ties that represented millions of dollars in investment capital, but had never spent a day breathing the metallic air of the factory floor or feeling the bone-deep fatigue that came from 10-hour shifts operating heavy machinery. Gerald Price sat to Victoria's immediate right, his laptop open as he prepared to field any legal questions about the restructuring initiatives that had made these impressive numbers possible.
Daniel entered the boardroom with Harold Bishop at exactly 10:15, their timing calculated to arrive during Victoria's presentation, when all attention would be focused on the quarterly performance metrics that had become the sole measure of the company's worth. The security badge that Harold had provided granted Daniel access to areas of the building he had never seen during his 30 years of employment, executive floors where decisions were made about people whose names would never appear on organizational charts or shareholder reports. Victoria paused mid-sentence when she noticed Harold approaching with an unexpected guest, her polished presentation rhythm disrupted by the appearance of someone whose work clothes and calloused hands marked him as clearly out of place in this sanctuary of corporate power. The other board members turned in their chairs, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to confusion as they tried to process why a factory worker was standing in their boardroom during a closed executive meeting. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Harold," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of forced politeness that barely concealed irritation, "I wasn't aware we were expecting additional attendees today." Harold moved with the deliberate confidence of someone who had been navigating corporate politics since before Victoria had earned her MBA, his presence commanding attention without theatricality or unnecessary drama. He carried a leather portfolio that contained the documents that would transform this routine quarterly meeting into something none of them would ever forget. "Board members," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly across the mahogany expanse, "I'd like you to meet Daniel Vega, the majority shareholder of Kane Industrial Solutions." The silence that followed was so complete that the ambient sounds of the building seemed amplified. The distant hum of machinery from the factory floor, the whisper of air conditioning through executive vents, and the almost audible shift in atmospheric pressure that accompanied moments when reality rearranged itself without warning. Victoria's face went through a series of micro-expressions that would have been comical if the implications hadn't been so profound. Confusion, disbelief, and the first stirrings of panic as her mind began processing what Harold's words actually meant. "That's impossible," Gerald Price interjected, his laptop forgotten as he leaned forward in his chair. "The majority shares are held in trust by Miguel Vega's estate.
I've reviewed those documents personally. Harold opened his portfolio with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared for this moment for years, extracting copies of the trust documents that Gerald had reviewed but never fully understood. The trust stipulated that ownership would transfer to McGill's son upon his death, with full authority granted when specific conditions were met. Daniel's unjust termination last week was one of those conditions. The papers passed from hand to hand around the table, each board member examining legal language that left no room for interpretation or challenge. The signatures were genuine, the legal structure was airtight, and the implications were staggering. The man they had just watched Victoria fire for prioritizing family over corporate policy now possessed the authority to hire and fire every person in the room, including Victoria herself. "This is preposterous," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly as her carefully maintained composure began to crack. "This is exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that leads to poor business outcomes. Sentiment doesn't pay shareholder dividends or maintain competitive market position. Neither does turnover from treating employees badly, or lawsuits from safety violations, or the reputation damage that comes from being known as a company that discards loyal workers when they need support most." Gerald Price cleared his throat, his legal training overriding whatever personal loyalties he might have felt toward Victoria's leadership style. The documents appeared to be in order.
Reluctantly. If Daniel chooses to exercise his authority as majority shareholder, there's no legal mechanism to prevent him from doing so. Daniel looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. Some returned his gaze with curiosity, others with caution, and a few with the calculating expression of people already trying to determine how to maintain their positions under new leadership. Victoria stared at him with undisguised hostility, her polished mask finally slipping to reveal the ruthless ambition that had driven her rise to power. "I'm not here to destroy what my father built," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the silent boardroom. "But I am here to restore what's been lost. Starting with a comprehensive review of our safety protocols, worker compensation packages, and the policies that have been driving experienced employees away from a company they once considered family." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair rolling backwards with enough force to strike the wall behind her. "You may have the legal authority," she said, her voice carrying the promise of future conflict, "but you have no idea what you're starting. This company operates in a competitive market that doesn't care about your sentimental attachment to obsolete employment practices." As she gathered her things and strode toward the boardroom exit, Daniel called after her. "We'll see," he said simply, the quiet confidence in his voice carrying more weight than any threat or ultimatum could have managed. The door closed behind Victoria with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence, leaving Daniel standing at the head of the table where his father had once sat, surrounded by people who were still trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The factory floor stretched beyond the windows like a promise waiting to be fulfilled, and for the first time in years, the future of Kane Industrial Solutions belonged to someone who remembered that companies were built by people, not just for profit. News traveled through the Kane Industrial Solutions factory floor with the speed and efficiency of a precision-engineered assembly line, carried by whispered conversations during shift changes and text messages that spread from department to department faster than any official company announcement could have managed. By noon, every worker in the facility knew that Daniel Vega had returned not as a terminated employee seeking reinstatement, but as the majority shareholder with authority that superseded Victoria Kane's executive power. And the implications of this revelation rippled through the workforce like electricity through copper wire. Avery Chen stood near the main production line during lunch break, watching his coworkers process this information with expressions that ranged from disbelief to cautious hope to outright excitement.
The break room buzzed with conversation as workers who had rarely spoken about company politics suddenly found themselves discussing labor relations and workplace safety with the fervor of people who had discovered their voices actually mattered. "Is it really true?" asked Maria Santos, a quality control inspector whose 22 years with the company had given her a front-row seat to the gradual erosion of worker protections under Victoria's leadership. "Daniel actually owns the company?" "Harold Bishop confirmed it himself," Avery replied, setting down his coffee cup with the careful satisfaction of someone delivering news that felt too good to be true. 51% ownership, inherited from his father. Miguel Vega apparently set up some kind of trust to protect the company from exactly what's been happening under Victoria's management. The revelation that Miguel Vega had been Daniel's father sent another wave of shock through the assembled workers. Many of them had started their careers when Miguel was still actively involved in daily operations, and they remembered him as a hands-on leader who knew every employee's name and understood that a company's real strength came from the people who showed up every day to build something together. "That explains a lot," Tommy Rodriguez said, a maintenance supervisor whose graying hair and scarred hands spoke of decades spent keeping complex machinery running smoothly. "Daniel always had that same way of looking at problems that Miguel did, like he could see through all the complications to what really needed fixing." When Daniel appeared in the break room doorway at exactly 12:30, conversation stopped as if someone had thrown a switch that controlled the room's audio system. He looked exactly as he had the week before when security had escorted him from the building, wearing the same work clothes and carrying himself with the same unpretentious confidence that had earned him respect among his peers long before anyone knew about hidden ownership documents or trust arrangements. "Mind if I join you?" Daniel asked, though he was already moving toward an empty chair at one of the worn Formica tables that had served as the break room's gathering spaces for as long as anyone could remember. The workers made room for him with the automatic courtesy of people who had shared countless lunch hours together, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in their movements as they adjusted to the idea that their former foreman now possessed authority that extended far beyond production schedules and safety protocols. "So," Avery said, breaking the silence with the directness that had always characterized their friendship. "Majority shareholder. That's quite a promotion from getting fired last week." Daniel smiled, the expression carrying relief and determination in equal measure. "Not a promotion, more like accepting a responsibility I never asked for but can't walk away from." Maria Santos leaned forward, her expression serious with the weight of concerns that had been building for months. "What does this mean for us? Victoria's been cutting benefits extended."
Mandatory overtime, and there have been rumors about more layoffs to improve the quarterly numbers. The questions came in a rush after that, workers sharing stories and concerns that had been suppressed under Victoria's management style. Safety inspections that had been quietly discontinued to save money. Equipment that was showing signs of wear but hadn't been scheduled for replacement because of budget constraints. Training programs that had been eliminated as unnecessary expenses, leaving newer employees without the knowledge they needed to perform their jobs safely and effectively. Daniel listened to each concern with the focused attention of someone who understood that these weren't abstract policy issues, but real problems that affected people's ability to provide for their families and return home safely at the end of each workday. His responses were measured and honest, acknowledging the magnitude of the challenges they faced while making it clear that change would take time and careful planning. "I can't fix everything overnight," Daniel said when the initial flood of concerns had been shared. "Victoria spent years implementing these policies, and unwinding them properly will require careful planning to avoid creating new problems. But I can promise you this: every decision we make will be evaluated based on whether it makes this a better place to work and a stronger company for the long term." Tommy Rodriguez raised his hand with the half-joking gesture of someone seeking permission to speak. "What about Victoria? She's not going to just accept this quietly. That woman doesn't know how to lose gracefully." Daniel's expression grew serious as he considered the question. Victoria is a formidable opponent who spent years building her power base within the company. She has allies among middle management and relationships with investors who share her philosophy about maximizing short-term profits. When she fights back, and she will fight back, she'll use every resource at her disposal to undermine the changes we're trying to implement. Then why take the risk? Asked Linda Walsh, a veteran assembler whose quiet demeanor concealed sharp intelligence and genuine concern for her co-workers' welfare. What about Victoria? She's not going to just accept this quietly. That woman doesn't know how to lose gracefully. Daniel's expression grew serious as he considered the question. Victoria is a formidable opponent who spent years building her power base within the company. She has allies among middle management and relationships with investors who share her philosophy about maximizing short-term profits. When she fights back, and she will fight back, she'll use every resource at her disposal to undermine the changes we're trying to implement. Then why take the risk? Asked Linda Walsh, a veteran assembler whose quiet demeanor concealed sharp intelligence and genuine concern for her co-workers' welfare. What about Victoria? She's not going to just accept this quietly. That woman doesn't know how to lose gracefully. Daniel looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over decades of shared work. People who had earned his respect through their dedication and skill long before he had known about inheritance documents or corporate structures. Because staying quiet would have meant watching you all continue to be treated as expendable assets instead of valued partners. My father built this company on the principle that people matter more than profit margins. It's time to remember what that actually means. Avery grinned, the expression carrying mischief and loyalty in equal measure. So what do you need from us? Information, Daniel replied without hesitation. I need to know about every safety concern, every equipment problem, every policy that's making your jobs harder or more dangerous. Victoria's people will try to hide problems or downplay their significance, so I'm depending on you to help me understand what's really happening on the factory floor. The workers exchanged glances, silent communications passing between people who had learned to read each other's expressions during years of working together under increasingly difficult conditions. What they saw in each other's faces was hope tempered by caution, the beginning of belief that change might actually be possible. There's going to be resistance, Maria warned. Some of the supervisors who got promoted under Victoria's system won't appreciate having their authority questioned by people they consider beneath them in the company hierarchy. Let me worry about the supervisors, Daniel said, his voice carrying quiet confidence. Anyone who can't adjust to treating workers with respect probably isn't someone we need in a leadership position anyway. As the lunch break drew to an end and workers began returning to their stations, Daniel felt the weight of their expectations settling on his shoulders, like a familiar tool belt. These people were depending on him to follow through on promises that would require navigating corporate politics he barely understood, while fighting opponents who had years of experience in boardroom warfare. Avery lingered as the break room emptied, his expression thoughtful as he considered the challenges ahead. You know she's going to come after you with everything she's got, he said quietly. Victoria Kane doesn't strike me as the type to accept defeat gracefully. Daniel nodded, understanding that the real battle was just beginning. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for her. As they walked back toward the production floor, Daniel could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere that came when people began to believe that their voices mattered and their concerns would be addressed. It was a fragile thing, this renewed sense of hope, but it carried the potential to transform not just workplace policies, but the entire culture of an organization that had forgotten its founding principles. The afternoon shift stretched ahead with its familiar rhythms of machinery and human coordination. But for the first time in years, the future felt like something the workers might actually help shape rather than simply endure. Victoria Kane's corner office overlooked the city's financial district from the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower, a glass and steel monument to corporate success that housed the headquarters of businesses whose influence extended far beyond the industrial parks where their products were actually manufactured.
Her rise through the corporate hierarchy, visual evidence of a career built on strategic thinking and relentless ambition that had never encountered an obstacle and couldn't eventually overcome. The emergency strategy session had been called for 7 a.m., early enough to avoid the attention of employees and investors who might misinterpret urgent meetings as signs of instability or crisis. Gerald Price sat across from Victoria's mahogany desk with legal documents spread before him like battle plans, his usually confident demeanor tempered by the reality that they were facing an opponent who held virtually unassailable legal authority. "The ownership transfer is airtight," Gerald said, his voice carrying the reluctant professionalism of someone delivering news that contradicted everything he had believed about corporate power structures. Miguel Vega's lawyers did exceptional work, creating a trust that anticipated almost every possible challenge. Daniel's position as majority shareholder is legally unquestionable. Victoria paced behind her desk, her movements sharp with controlled energy as she processed the implications of finding herself in a position where legal authority belonged to someone else. The quarterly profits that had seemed like such a triumph just days before now felt fragile, vulnerable to changes in leadership philosophy that could undo years of carefully implemented efficiency improvements. "Legal authority is one thing," Victoria said, stopping at the window to stare down at the morning traffic that flowed through the city's arterial streets like blood through corporate veins. "Public perception is something else entirely. Daniel may own 51% of the company, but he has no experience in executive management, no understanding of market pressures, and no comprehension of the sacrifices necessary to maintain competitive advantage in a global economy." The phone on her desk rang with a discreet chime that indicated a call from her private line, the number reserved for contacts whose influence extended beyond the boundaries of traditional business relationships. "Marcus," she said, recognizing the voice of Marcus Webb, senior business reporter for the Herald Tribune, whose coverage of corporate affairs could make or break executive reputations with the precision of surgical instruments. "Thank you for getting back to me so quickly." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in information warfare, Victoria carefully planting seeds of doubt about Daniel's qualifications while maintaining the appearance of objective concern for the company's future stability. She spoke of unprecedented disruption to established management practices, the risks associated with emotional decision-making in corporate environments, and the potential impact on shareholder value if inexperienced leadership began implementing changes based on sentiment rather than sound business principles. "Of course I want what's best for the company," Victoria said, her voice carrying just the right note of reluctant professionalism. "But when someone with no executive experience suddenly assumes control of a multi-million-dollar operation, responsible observers have to ask whether employees' jobs and investors' returns are really being protected." Gerald listened to this performance with professional admiration tinged by moral discomfort, recognizing the skill with which Victoria managed to plant damaging suggestions while maintaining plausible deniability about her motives. She was positioning herself as the responsible adult in a situation created by legal technicalities and family sentimentality, the steady hand that could guide the company through a crisis not of her making. The Tribune article appeared online at 10:30 a.m. with a headline that sent tremors through the local business community. "Factory foreman's surprise inheritance raises questions about corporate stability." The piece quoted unnamed sources within Kane Industrial Solutions expressing concern about sudden leadership changes and the potential impact on operational efficiency, painting Daniel as well-intentioned but dangerously unprepared for the responsibilities that had been thrust upon him. But Maya Ortiz had been covering corporate malfeasance long enough to recognize a coordinated public relations campaign when she saw one. And something about the Tribune's coverage triggered her investigative instincts like a smoke alarm detecting the first wisps of a hidden fire.
The unanimous nature of the unnamed source's concerns, the carefully worded quotes that managed to sound spontaneous while hitting every talking point that would favor Victoria's position, and the notable absence of any worker perspectives from the factory floor all suggested a story that had been shaped rather than simply reported. Maya's follow-up research began with public record searches that revealed patterns of safety violations and worker complaints that had been filed with state agencies over the past 18 months, during which time Victoria had been implementing her efficiency initiatives. The documentation painted a picture of systemic corner-cutting that prioritized short-term cost savings over long-term sustainability. Exactly the kind of corporate behavior that Maya had built her reputation exposing. When Maya called Daniel directly, reaching him through the company's main switchboard, she expected to encounter the kind of inexperienced defensive posturing that often characterized business owners who found themselves thrust into public controversies. Instead, she found someone who answered questions with thoughtful honesty and readily agreed to meet for an extended interview about his plans for the company. They met at Elena's Cafe, a family-owned restaurant near the factory district, where working people gathered for coffee that was strong enough to fuel double shifts and conversation that stayed focused on practical concerns rather than abstract theories. Daniel arrived in work clothes, having spent the morning walking the factory floor and listening to employees share concerns that had been building for months under Victoria's management.
"I never expected to own this company," Daniel said when Maya asked about his sudden transition from employee to majority shareholder. "But I've spent 30 years watching my father's vision get slowly stripped away by people who see workers as cost centers rather than partners. If I have the legal authority to restore what's been lost, then I have a responsibility to use it." Maya listened to Daniel's account of his firing, his discovery of the inheritance documents, and his plans for implementing changes that would prioritize worker safety and long-term sustainability over quarterly profit maximization. His responses carried the ring of authenticity that came from someone speaking about deeply held convictions rather than reciting prepared talking points. Victoria Kane's supporters suggest that emotional decision-making could damage the company's competitive position, Maya said, testing Daniel's response to the main line of attack that Victoria's media campaign had established. Daniel considered the question carefully before responding. "I think there's a difference between emotional decision-making and recognizing that a company's most valuable assets are the people who show up every day to build something together. The efficiency improvements that have driven recent profit increases came at the cost of worker safety, employee retention, and the kind of institutional knowledge that you can't replace by hiring cheaper labor." The article that Maya published 3 days later carried the headline, "Worker Turned Owner, Inside the Fight for Kane Industrial Soul," and presented a perspective that the Tribune's coverage had completely ignored. Maya had interviewed current and former employees who painted a detailed picture of declining working conditions under Victoria's leadership, safety inspectors who confirmed patterns of violations that had been quietly addressed through fines rather than systematic reforms, and industry analysts who suggested that short-term profit maximization often came at the expense of long-term competitiveness. The public response to Maya's article was swift and decisive, with social media amplifying stories from workers who had been afraid to speak openly about their experiences under Victoria's management. Local news stations picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath narrative that resonated with viewers who had their own experiences with corporate indifference to worker concerns. Victoria's carefully orchestrated media campaign began to backfire as public attention focused not on Daniel's qualifications for executive leadership, but on the conditions that had made his intervention necessary. Board members who had initially supported Victoria's position began privately expressing concerns about the company's public image and the potential for consumer boycotts or regulatory investigations. "The narrative is getting away from us," Gerald warned during another emergency strategy session. "Instead of questioning Daniel's competence, people are questioning why those working conditions were allowed to exist in the first place." Victoria stared out her office window at the city below, where news vans had begun gathering outside the Kane Industrial Solutions facility as reporters sought to interview workers about their experiences under competing management philosophies. The clean lines of corporate power that had seemed so clear just a week before were beginning to blur as public opinion shifted toward supporting the underdog in a story that was rapidly taking on mythic proportions. "Then we change tactics," Victoria said, her voice carrying the cold determination of someone who had never learned to accept defeat gracefully. "If we can't win the public relations war, we'll have to find other ways to protect the company from well-intentioned but dangerous leadership." The real battle for control of Kane Industrial Solutions was just beginning, and Victoria Kane was preparing to use every weapon at her disposal to ensure that good intentions didn't destroy the profitable efficiency that had defined her tenure as CEO. The emergency siren that pierced the morning air at Kane Industrial Solutions carried a sound that every factory worker recognized with bone-deep familiarity. The electronic wail that meant someone's day had taken a turn toward hospital rooms and insurance forms, and the kind of conversations that families never wanted to have. Daniel was in his temporary office reviewing safety inspection reports when the alarm began its relentless cycle, and he moved toward the factory floor with the purposeful urgency of someone whose first instinct was always to help rather than delegate responsibility to others. The accident had happened at Station 7 on the main production line, where a hydraulic press that should have been replaced 6 months ago had finally surrendered to the accumulated stress of operating beyond its designed capacity. 23-year-old Marcus Rivera had been feeding steel components into the machine when a pressure valve that had been flagged for replacement during the last safety audit finally failed catastrophically, sending superheated hydraulic fluid across his left arm and shoulder with the kind of industrial violence that transformed routine work into medical emergencies. Avery Chen was already on scene when Daniel arrived, his first aid training taking over as he helped guide Marcus toward the ambulance that emergency services had positioned near the factory's main entrance. The young man's face was pale with shock and pain, but he was conscious and talking, which meant that whatever damage had been done was probably not life-threatening, even though it would certainly be life-changing.
Initiatives, even minor expenditures, required justification and approval from managers who had never operated the equipment they were making decisions about. "Who signed off on delaying the replacement?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Victoria herself," Avery replied, producing a copy of the maintenance request that had been stamped with a red denial and filed away with dozens of similar documents. "Cost reduction initiative. She said the valve to be monitored for deterioration and replaced during the next scheduled maintenance cycle." The next scheduled maintenance cycle was still 3 months away, Daniel realized, a timeline that treated mechanical components like calendar appointments rather than safety-critical systems that could fail without notice. Marcus Rivera was going to spend weeks in recovery because someone in an executive office had decided that quarterly profit margins were more important than the well-being of people who actually built the products that generated those profits. Daniel's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Victoria, whose response to workplace emergencies typically focused on containing liability exposure rather than addressing underlying safety concerns. He answered on the third ring, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger that was building in his chest like pressure in a hydraulic system that had been pushed beyond its designed limits. "I heard about the accident," Victoria said, her tone carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who had learned to express appropriate concern without accepting responsibility for preventable problems. Workplace injuries are always unfortunate, but they're an inevitable part of industrial operations. The important thing now is to ensure that our response follows proper protocols." "The important thing," Daniel replied, his voice hardening with each word, "is that a 23-year-old kid is in the hospital because we delayed replacing a $50 valve to save money on quarterly expenses." Victoria's pause carried the weight of someone calculating political responses rather than processing human consequences. "Industrial equipment fails sometimes, Daniel. That's why we carry comprehensive insurance and maintain detailed safety protocols. One isolated incident doesn't justify disrupting operational efficiency with unnecessary equipment replacements." The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental difference between their approaches to corporate leadership. Victoria spoke of statistical safety records and liability management, of industry standards and acceptable risk levels that treated worker injuries as inevitable costs of doing business. Daniel talked about Marcus Rivera's family and the other workers who operated similar equipment every day, about the moral responsibility that came with asking people to trust their safety to machines that management knew were deteriorating. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting," Daniel said, finally, cutting through Victoria's recitation of corporate risk management principles. "We're going to approve funding for every safety upgrade that's been delayed or denied over the past 2 years." "That's completely unnecessary," Victoria responded, her professional composure beginning to crack as she realized that Daniel was prepared to use his authority in ways that would directly challenge her management philosophy. "Emergency board meetings create the impression of crisis management, which could affect investor confidence in stock valuations." "Good," Daniel said simply. "Maybe investor confidence should be affected when a company prioritizes profit margins over worker safety." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, giving Daniel and Harold Bishop 3 days to prepare presentations that would make the case for systematic safety improvements that would require significant capital investment. Victoria used the same time to marshal support from board members who shared her concerns about operational disruption and financial impact, building a coalition of investors who viewed Daniel's proposed changes as dangerous sentimentality that could undermine the company's competitive position. Meanwhile, Maya Ortiz's investigation into the accident revealed a pattern of safety violations and delayed maintenance that extended far beyond the hydraulic press failure. Her interviews with current and former employees documented a systematic erosion of safety protocols under Victoria's leadership, with cost-cutting measures that had eliminated redundant systems and extended equipment maintenance cycles beyond manufacturer recommendations. The story that Maya published carried the headline, "Preventable Accident Highlights Safety Crisis at Kane Industrial," and included detailed documentation of the safety inspection reports that had been ignored, the maintenance requests that had been denied, and the statistical analysis showing that workplace injuries had increased by 37% since Victoria had implemented her efficiency initiatives. Daniel visited Marcus Rivera at the hospital on Thursday evening, bringing flowers from Elena and a promise that the company would cover all medical expenses beyond what insurance provided. The young man was awake and alert, his left arm heavily bandaged, but his spirits lifted by pain medication and the knowledge that his injuries, while serious, would heal completely with time and proper care. "I don't blame you, Mr. Vega," Marcus said, when Daniel began to apologize for the accident. "Everyone knows you've been trying to get those safety issues addressed. It's not your fault that some people think worker safety is too expensive." But Daniel did blame himself, understanding that his legal authority came with moral responsibility for every decision that affected the people who worked under his ownership. The hydraulic press failure was a symptom of larger problems that had been building for years, and changing the company's culture would require more than emergency board meetings and capital expenditures. As he drove home through the evening traffic, Daniel's phone rang with updates from Harold Bishop about board member positions and voting strategies, but his thoughts remained focused on Marcus Rivera's bandaged arm and the dozens of other safety issues that had been documented but not addressed. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine whether Kane Industrial Solutions would return to the safety-first principles that his father had established or continue down a path that treated worker injuries as acceptable costs of doing business. The real test of his leadership was about to begin, and Daniel knew that Victoria Kane would use every political weapon at her disposal to prevent changes that would challenge the efficiency-focused philosophy that had defined her tenure as CEO. The Kane Industrial Solutions boardroom had been transformed for the emergency shareholders meeting into something resembling a courtroom more than a corporate conference space, with reporters crowding the hallway outside and workers gathered in the parking lot below, their faces turned toward the executive windows as if they could somehow influence the proceedings through collective will and shared concern for their own safety and job security. The legal requirements for shareholder notification had brought out minority investors who rarely attended routine meetings, along with institutional representatives whose presence indicated that the outcome would have implications extending far beyond the walls of a single manufacturing facility. Victoria Kane entered the boardroom with the calculated confidence of someone who had spent 3 days building coalitions and calling in favors from board members whose own interests aligned with maintaining the cost-cutting efficiency measures that had driven recent profit increases. She carried herself with the rigid posture of someone prepared for battle, her tailored suit and precise makeup serving as armor against the emotional appeals and worker advocacy that she expected Daniel to deploy in place of sound business reasoning. Gerald Price had prepared a presentation that framed the safety upgrade proposals as unnecessary capital expenditures that would compromise the company's competitive position in a global marketplace where efficiency and cost control determine survival. His legal analysis suggested that the hydraulic press failure represented an isolated incident rather than systematic negligence, and that approving expensive equipment replacements based on emotional responses to single accidents would establish dangerous precedents for future operational decisions. Daniel sat at the head of the mahogany table with Harold Bishop at his right hand, surrounded by documents that told a different story about workplace safety and corporate responsibility. Maya Ortiz's investigative reporting had provided statistical analyses that revealed patterns of preventable accidents and maintenance delays, while Avery Chen had compiled testimony from workers who had been documenting safety concerns for months without receiving meaningful responses from management. The morning session began with Victoria's presentation about fiscal responsibility and market pressures, her voice carrying the smooth authority of someone who had mastered the language of corporate decision-making. She spoke of industry standards and acceptable risk levels, of insurance coverage and liability management, of the need to balance worker safety with operational efficiency in ways that protected both employee welfare and shareholder value. The tragic accident involving Marcus Rivera represents exactly the kind of isolated incident that comprehensive insurance policies are designed to address, Victoria said, her tone carrying practiced sympathy that managed to acknowledge human cost while minimizing corporate responsibility. Implementing expensive equipment upgrades in response to single failures would create precedents that could bankrupt the company through unnecessary capital expenditures. Her presentation included charts and graphs that compared Kane Industrial safety record to industry averages, statistical analyses that suggested their workplace injury rates fell within acceptable parameters for manufacturing operations of their size and complexity. The data was accurate but incomplete, focusing on reported incidents while ignoring near misses and the kinds of minor injuries that workers often chose not to document rather than risk being labeled as safety concerns by management. When Daniel's turn came to address the board, he rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent the previous night preparing for the most important speech of his professional life.
His presentation materials included photographs of damaged equipment, copies of safety inspection reports that had been filed and ignored, and testimonials from workers whose concerns had been dismissed as obstacles to operational efficiency. 3 days ago, Marcus Rivera went to the hospital because we decided that $50 was too much to spend on a hydraulic valve. That decision wasn't made by some distant corporate bureaucracy. It was made by people in this room who chose quarterly profit margins over the safety of a 23-year-old kid who trusted us to provide him with equipment that wouldn't hurt him. The presentation that followed was a systematic dismantling of the cost-cutting measures that had created predictable safety hazards while generating impressive short-term financial results. Daniel displayed photographs of equipment that was operating beyond manufacturer specifications, documented maintenance requests that had been denied or delayed for budgetary reasons, and statistical analysis showing that workplace injuries had increased significantly since Victoria had implemented her efficiency initiatives. My father built this company on the principle that people matter more than profit margins. Not because he was sentimental, but because he understood that sustainable success requires treating skilled workers as partners rather than disposable assets. Gerald Price provided supporting analysis that demonstrated the long-term financial costs of high employee turnover, workplace accidents, and the reputation damage that came from being known as a company that prioritized profits over worker safety. His presentation included comparisons to companies that invested in proactive safety measures, demonstrating that indeed an excellent company investing in safety had better long-term financial returns than those that did not.
Examples of competitors who had invested in comprehensive safety programs and achieved both lower injury rates and higher productivity through improved worker morale and retention. The board members listened to these competing presentations with expressions that revealed the complex political calculations taking place as they tried to determine which approach would best serve their own interests. Some appeared genuinely concerned about the safety issues that had been documented, while others seemed more focused on the financial implications of the proposed equipment upgrades. Victoria's rebuttal focused on the practical challenges of implementing expensive safety measures in a competitive marketplace where cost control often determines success or failure. Daniel's concerns about worker safety are admirable, she said, her tone suggesting that admirable and practical were mutually exclusive concepts. But companies that prioritize sentiment over sound business practices don't survive long enough to provide jobs for anyone. The discussion that followed revealed fundamental disagreements about corporate responsibility and the proper balance between worker welfare and shareholder returns. Board members questioned both presenters about implementation timelines, financial projections, and the potential impact on company competitiveness. Their questions revealing assumptions about business priorities that would ultimately determine how they voted. When Harold Bishop stood to provide the decisive intervention that would swing the vote in Daniel's favor, his presentation carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the company's transformation from family business to corporate entity and understood what had been lost in the process. 30 years ago, Miguel Vega asked me to help him structure a trust that would protect this company from exactly the kind of short-sighted decision-making that led to Marcus Rivera's accident, Harold said, his voice carrying across the silent boardroom. He foresaw the possibility that future leadership might prioritize quarterly profits over the principles that built sustainable success. Harold's revelation about Victoria's systematic suppression of safety audit recommendations provided the smoking gun that several board members had been waiting for, documentation that showed a pattern of negligence rather than isolated incidents. The evidence included safety reports that had been filed but never acted upon, maintenance requests that had been denied despite inspector recommendations, and internal communications that revealed Victoria's deliberate decision to delay equipment upgrades in order to improve quarterly financial results. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Daniel had hoped, but decisive enough to establish his authority as majority shareholder. 7 board members supported the comprehensive safety upgrade program, while 4 voted with Victoria to maintain the current cost-cutting approach. The margin was narrow enough to indicate ongoing political challenges, but wide enough to begin implementing the changes that would restore workers' safety as a corporate priority. Victoria's face remained composed throughout the vote count, but Daniel could see the rage building behind her professional mask as she realized that her carefully constructed power base had been insufficient to prevent what she viewed as dangerous sentimentality from undermining sound business practices. When the meeting adjourned, she gathered her materials with movements that were slightly too sharp, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of a defeat that felt both personal and ideological. "You may have won today," Victoria said quietly as board members filed out of the conference room, her voice carrying the cold promise of someone who had never learned to accept defeat gracefully. "But this isn't over. I'll burn this company down before I let you transform it into some kind of charitable organization that prioritizes worker feelings over shareholder returns." Daniel met her gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had discovered that legal authority, when combined with moral purpose, could overcome even sophisticated political opposition. "Good luck with that," he said simply, understanding that Victoria Kane's threats revealed both her determination and her fundamental misunderstanding of what made companies successful over the long term. As the boardroom emptied and the reporters in the hallway began crafting stories about corporate responsibility and workplace safety, Daniel looked out the windows toward the factory floor where Avery Chen was already beginning to implement the equipment upgrades that would prevent future accidents. The real work of leadership was just beginning, but for the first time since discovering his inheritance, Daniel felt confident that Kane Industrial Solutions was moving in the right direction. The Monday morning that followed the emergency board meeting arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made industrial work feel purposeful rather than punishing, and Daniel Vega walked the factory floor of Kane Industrial Solutions with the measured pace of someone who was finally able to match his authority with his convictions. The safety upgrade program had been approved by a narrow but decisive margin, and the first new equipment deliveries were scheduled to begin arriving within the week. But transforming a corporate culture required more than emergency resolutions and capital expenditures. Avery Chen met him near the main production line with a clipboard full of reports and the satisfied expression of someone whose safety concerns were finally being taken seriously by management. The safety committee that Daniel had established was already documenting equipment issues and maintenance needs with the thoroughness of people who understood that their recommendations would actually be implemented rather than filed away for future consideration. "Station 7 is shut down until the new hydraulic press arrives," Avery reported, gesturing toward the area where Marcus Rivera's accident had occurred 3 days earlier. "We've got the whole line running through Station 8 for now, which slows things down a bit, but nobody's complaining about safer working conditions."
The production slowdown was exactly the kind of efficiency loss that Victoria Kane had warned about during the board meeting, Daniel reflected, but the workers seemed more focused and engaged now that they knew their safety concerns were being addressed systematically rather than dismissed as obstacles to operational efficiency. Morale improvements were difficult to quantify on quarterly reports, but they translated into measurable benefits through reduced turnover, lower absenteeism, and the kind of institutional knowledge that experienced employees brought to problem solving. Daniel's first major personnel decision involved replacing 3 middle managers who had been instrumental in implementing Victoria's cost-cutting measures and had made it clear that they couldn't adjust to a management philosophy that prioritized worker safety over quarterly profit margins. The terminations were handled with professional courtesy but decisive finality, sending a clear message throughout the organization that the new leadership structure would not tolerate resistance to safety improvements. "Tommy Rodriguez is going to take over as production supervisor," Daniel told Avery as they walked past the quality control stations where employees were conducting the kind of thorough inspections that had been streamlined out of existence under Victoria's efficiency initiatives. 28 years on the floor, safety committee chair for the past 5 years, and the respect of everyone who works under him. The promotion of Tommy Rodriguez from maintenance supervisor to production management represented more than just a personnel change.
It signaled a fundamental shift toward valuing practical experience and worker advocacy over corporate climbing and profit maximization. Tommy's first initiative involved reinstating the comprehensive safety training program that had been eliminated as unnecessary expense, ensuring that new employees understood both proper equipment operation and their rights to report unsafe working conditions without fear of retaliation. Maya Ortiz's follow-up article about the safety improvements carried the headline "Worker-turned-owner delivers on safety promises," and included interviews with employees who described a palpable change in workplace atmosphere since Daniel had assumed control of the company. The story documented the equipment upgrades that were already underway, the safety training programs that had been reinstated, and the Worker Safety Committee that was being given real authority to identify and address potential hazards. "It feels like we matter again," Maria Santos told Maya during an interview conducted in the factory break room. "For the past few years, it seemed like management saw us as problems to be solved, rather than people who actually build the products that keep this company profitable." The positive media coverage attracted attention from industry analysts who suggested that Daniel's approach represented a return to manufacturing principles that had built American industrial success before corporate short-termism became the dominant business philosophy. Several articles compared Kane Industrial Solutions to companies that had achieved both strong safety records and sustained profitability through worker-focused management practices. But Victoria Kane was not accepting defeat gracefully, and her response to Daniel's growing success involved quiet meetings with corporate lawyers and investment advisors who specialized in hostile takeover scenarios and asset liquidation strategies. Gerald Price had been tasked with exploring legal challenges to Daniel's authority, while Victoria herself began reaching out to private equity firms that might be interested in acquiring a controlling interest in a manufacturing company with valuable industrial assets and an inexperienced majority shareholder. The first indication of Victoria's counter-strategy came during a routine weekly management meeting when she announced that she had been approached by Meridian Capital Partners, a private equity firm that specialized in manufacturing acquisitions and operational restructuring. The initial contact had supposedly been unsolicited, but Victoria suspected that she had initiated the conversations as part of a broader strategy to undermine his leadership by creating external pressure for changes that would restore her preferred management approach. Meridian has expressed interest in discussing potential partnership opportunities, Victoria announced during the management meeting, her tone carrying the practiced neutrality of someone presenting information rather than making recommendations. Their preliminary analysis suggests that Kane Industrial Solutions has significant untapped value that could be realized through operational optimization and strategic restructuring. Harold Bishop's expression during this announcement revealed both alarm and understanding. Alarm at the threat that private equity involvement would pose to worker-focused management, and understanding that Victoria was beginning to deploy the kinds of corporate warfare tactics that could destroy the company rather than allowed to continue under Daniel's leadership philosophy. "What kind of partnership opportunities?" Daniel asked, though he suspected that partnership was a euphemism for acquisition and control transfer. "Asset optimization, operational efficiency improvements, and capital structure reorganization. Meridian specializes in helping manufacturing companies achieve their full profit potential through proven management strategies." The meeting that followed revealed the sophistication of Victoria's strategy. She had positioned the private equity approach as an opportunity rather than a threat, suggesting that Daniel's inexperience in corporate finance made external expertise necessary for protecting shareholder value and ensuring competitive sustainability. Her presentation implied that refusing to consider professional management assistance would be evidence of ego-driven decision-making that prioritized personal control over business success. Daniel's response was measured but firm. "I'm not interested in partnerships that would compromise our commitment to worker safety and long-term sustainability." understanding that this was likely the opening move in a campaign that would test his resolve and his ability to maintain control of the company his father had built. After the meeting, Harold Bishop provided the context that Daniel needed to understand what they were facing. Private equity firms like Meridian don't buy manufacturing companies to improve working conditions, Harold explained as they walked toward Daniel's office. They acquire undervalued assets, strip out expenses they consider unnecessary, and resell the streamlined operations to maximize returns for their investors. The implications were clear. Victoria was preparing to use external pressure to force changes that would undo everything Daniel had accomplished since revealing his ownership. The safety improvements, worker-focused management philosophy, and long-term sustainability initiatives that had begun to transform Kane Industrial Solutions would be reversed in favor of the kind of efficiency maximization that treated skilled workers as disposable assets. "What are our options?" Daniel asked, though he was already beginning to understand that defending his vision for the company would require more than legal authority and moral conviction. "We fight," Harold said simply. "We prove that worker-focused management can deliver sustainable profits, and we make sure that Victoria's private equity friends understand that Kane Industrial Solutions isn't available for the kind of operational restructuring they specialize in." As Daniel walked home that evening, past the factory where third-shift workers were beginning their night's production under safer working conditions and with renewed confidence in management's commitment to their welfare, he understood that the real battle for the soul of Kane Industrial Solutions was just beginning. Victoria Kane had revealed her willingness to destroy the company rather than accept his leadership, and the next phase of their conflict would determine whether corporate responsibility could survive in a business environment that often rewarded short-term thinking over sustainable success. The rain began falling at dawn on the day that would determine the future of Kane Industrial Solutions. Heavy droplets that struck the executive floor windows with the persistence of someone demanding entry to conversations that would reshape lives and livelihoods for years to come. Victoria Kane stood in her corner office staring out at the gray morning, while Gerald Price spread legal documents across her mahogany desk like battle plans for a war that only one of them could survive. "The Meridian Capital offer is finalized," Gerald said, his voice carrying the clinical precision of someone who had spent weeks crafting agreements that would transfer control of the company to investors who specialized in extracting maximum value from manufacturing assets. "They're prepared to purchase all outstanding shares except Daniel's majority stake at 30% above current market value." Victoria turned from the window with the calculated movements of someone who had built her career on strategic thinking and was now prepared to deploy the most dangerous weapon in her corporate arsenal. The private equity acquisition would effectively isolate Daniel as majority shareholder of a company whose day-to-day operations would be controlled by people who shared her philosophy about efficiency and profit maximization. "And if Daniel refuses to cooperate with the new ownership structure?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. "Meridian specializes in hostile restructuring. They have extensive experience in situations where founding families or inherited ownership resist operational optimization. Legal mechanisms exist to force compliance with majority investor decisions." The plan was elegant in its ruthlessness. Since Victoria couldn't remove Daniel from his position as majority shareholder, she would surround him with new investors whose financial resources and corporate expertise would make his worker-focused management philosophy impossible to implement. Meridian Capital would bring the kind of institutional pressure that could override individual conscience through legal complexity and financial leverage. Victoria's phone rang at exactly 9 a.m. with news that Daniel had requested an immediate meeting in her office, and she accepted with the satisfaction of someone who held information that would transform their power dynamic forever. When Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that had sustained him through factory floor conflicts and boardroom politics, but Victoria could see the concern in his eyes that suggested he understood the magnitude of what they were facing. "I heard about Meridian Capital," Daniel said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Victoria's desk with the direct honesty that had always characterized his approach to difficult conversations. "I heard Harold tells me they've made offers to acquire minority shareholdings from board members." Victoria's smile was sharp with anticipated victory. "Business is business, Daniel. When investors recognize untapped value in manufacturing operations, they naturally seek opportunities to realize that potential through proven management strategies." "Proven strategies for firing workers and cutting safety expenses," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the implications of what Victoria was proposing. "Meridian's track record includes plant closures, mass layoffs, and the kind of operational restructuring that destroys communities while generating impressive returns for distant investors."
"You can't stop this," Victoria said finally, her professional mask slipping to reveal the satisfaction of someone who had maneuvered an opponent into checkmate. "Meridian has the financial resources to acquire controlling interest from minority shareholders, and their expertise in operational restructuring will restore the efficiency standards that have been compromised by your sentimental approach to management." Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folder that contained documents Victoria had never seen before. Legal papers that Gerald Price examined with growing alarm as he recognized the implications of what Daniel had quietly arranged during the weeks while Victoria had been building her private equity coalition. "Actually, I can stop it," Daniel said simply, his voice carrying quiet confidence that came from understanding his father's planning better than Victoria ever had. Miguel's trust included provisions for exactly this scenario. If outside investors attempted to acquire controlling interest for the purpose of operational restructuring, I was given authority to purchase all outstanding shares using dividends that had been accumulating for 5 years. The documents that Daniel spread across Victoria's desk revealed financial arrangements that neither she nor Gerald had anticipated. Miguel Vega's trust had been generating substantial dividends that had been held in reserve specifically for defending against hostile acquisition attempts, and Daniel now possessed both the legal authority and financial resources to buy out every minority shareholder who had agreed to sell to Meridian Capital. The buyout offer is 40% above market value. Every board member who sells to me retains their position and continues receiving dividends from a company that prioritizes sustainable success over short-term profit maximization. Victoria stared at the documents with the expression of someone watching carefully laid plans crumble into dust, her sophisticated financial maneuvering reduced to irrelevance by foresight she had never imagined. Miguel Vega had anticipated not just her specific tactics, but the entire category of corporate warfare that prioritized investor returns over worker welfare. "This is impossible," Victoria said, her voice tight with rage and disbelief. "No one maintains that kind of cash reserve for hypothetical acquisition defense." Miguel did, because he understood that protecting workers and community sometimes requires having resources that purely profit-focused competitors don't expect you to possess. The final revelation came when Harold Bishop arrived with signed agreements from 6 of the 7 board members who had been considering Meridian's offer, each of them choosing Daniel's buyout over private equity acquisition once they understood the alternative involved mass layoffs and operational restructuring that would destroy the company's reputation in the community where they all lived and worked. Victoria's defeat was complete and undeniable. Her carefully orchestrated private equity strategy neutralized by financial planning that had begun years before she had ever imagined needing to defend against it. Gerald Price gathered his legal documents with the efficiency of someone recognizing that his services were no longer required.
while Victoria stared out the window at the factory floor, where workers were beginning their shifts under management that valued their safety and dignity. "I resign," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose identity had been built on corporate power that no longer existed. "Effective immediately." Daniel accepted her resignation with professional courtesy but no satisfaction, understanding that Victoria's departure was necessary, but taking no pleasure in the personal defeat of someone whose talents could have been channeled toward building rather than extracting value. Her vision of corporate efficiency had been genuine, even if fundamentally flawed, and her departure left gaps in institutional knowledge that would need to be filled carefully. 3 hours later, Daniel stood on the factory floor, wearing his work boots and safety glasses, addressing the assembled workers who had gathered during lunch break to hear about the changes that would define their future. The rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight streamed through industrial windows to illuminate faces that carried hope, tempered by cautious optimism. "Victoria Kane has resigned," Daniel announced, his words carrying across the suddenly silent factory floor. "Meridian Capital's acquisition attempt has been terminated, and Kane Industrial Solutions will remain an independent company committed to worker safety, fair compensation, and sustainable business practices." The cheers that followed carried relief and vindication in equal measure, but Daniel raised his hand for silence before the celebration could build momentum. "This victory doesn't mean our work is finished. It means we now have the opportunity to prove that companies can be both profitable and principled, that treating workers as partners rather than assets creates sustainable success for everyone." As the workers returned to their stations with renewed energy and purpose, Daniel walked the production line with Avery Chen, checking safety equipment and listening to suggestions for improvements that would make their workplace both more efficient and more humane. The factory hummed with productive activity that carried dignity alongside determination. And for the first time since discovering his inheritance, Daniel felt that Kane Industrial Solutions was truly living up to the principles his father had intended. Outside, the last of the rain clouds were breaking apart to reveal blue sky that stretched over a community where a manufacturing company had chosen worker welfare over investor demands, proving that corporate responsibility was not just possible, but profitable when leadership remembered that businesses existed to serve people rather than the other way around. Daniel Vega had walked into Kane Industrial Solutions as a fired foreman and emerged as an owner who never forgot where he came from, carrying forward his father's vision into a future where honest work would be honored and rewarded rather than exploited and discarded. The real work of leadership was just beginning, but it would be built on foundations strong enough to last. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it'll take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.